Hi everybody, Charlie Kerrigan is my name. I teach Latin here at TCD and I'm here to give you a short presentation, 10 minutes or so, on the Living Latin project here at Trinity. I'm going to start with some theory, I'm going to tell you a little bit about our practice, and then I'm going to finish with some reflection. So the theory is drawn mainly from educators and educationalists who I like and find inspiring. Mary Wollstonecraft says that real education is self-education. So a good teacher can provoke you, perhaps inspire you, but the real work of learning is the learner's own business. That's something that I really think is true, and it's something that I always bear in mind when I'm teaching. John Dewey, 20th century American philosopher, educationalist. There is no such thing as educational value in the abstract. Again, something I take to heart. It's not what you teach, but it's how you teach. It's not the transmission of knowledge per se, as it is a kind of a series of productive encounters between teacher and students. Maxine Greene, another 20th century American teacher and thinker, she talks about wide awakeness. So she's talking about encounters with art and literature and how they can fire the learner's imagination, both in a personal dimension, but also in a more general or a more social or collective dimension. So how can art and literature raise questions not just of the self, but of wider society and its concerns? And her nice kind of two-word or one-word takeaway for that in her writing is wide awakeness as the goal of pedagogy, generating a kind of awareness of the self and of one's community and society. What do I take away from these writers? Well, it's encounters with, not mastery of, Latin as a means of provoking students into their own educational journeys by means of the humane archive, that's the good and the bad, that Latin and Latin culture provides. And also, just to add, very much for me, it's about the present moment as much as the past, not so much about evoking images or harking back to images of ancient Rome, but about the present moment and how Latin might be useful in the present moment. Some references there if you need them. In terms of practice, well, TCD's Living Latin project was founded in 2019 and it currently has 3 elements. There's a free web-based app for elementary Latin learning that's called Tabella. There's a series of 24 blog posts on the history of Latin that I have written called Confabulations. And there's also a volume of 50 responses to one line from ancient Greek and Roman literature, solicited from the wider TCD Classics community. That was published as a volume in 2018, and there's a page dedicated to it as part of the Living Latin project. The project aims to make Latin a more welcoming and accessible subject, regarding feminist and decolonizing positions as central to any such effort. As a free resource, it is available to anyone with an internet connection. And you can explore it further at the link there. This year, elementary Latin is taught in TCD to 4 groups. We have full-time undergraduates and postgraduates who are doing an intensive year-long course. We have 58 students in our elective module, which I teach with a team here in the department. They are drawn from all over campus, which is quite exciting, and they get a kind of intro to Latin and Latin culture with both linguistic and cultural elements. There's also our long-running evening course, which is on a Wednesday evening. Our extramural students, they make up the 4th cohort of our teaching of Latin in Trinity. This year, the groups number 20, 25, 58, and 22, respectively, and the overall gender balance is roughly 60-40 female-male. The Living Latin project is integrated into all elementary Latin teaching, so undergraduates and postgraduates use Tabella as an additional learning resource that's auxiliary to their textbook. In term 1, they write a personal and creative response to a lesson from Tabella for 10%, and in term 2, they each have a go at writing their own confabulation, their own 750-word blog post about Latin and the history of Latin, some aspect of it that interests them. Tabella and confabulations are both integral to the elective and the extramural courses. So our elective module is structured around Tabella and confabulations this term, and the extramural course in a similar way is structured around those 2 resources. But I should note that the extramural course, it's a kind of reciprocal relationship, and that I use those resources on a Wednesday evening, but my Wednesday evening classes have very much inspired a lot of the material and content in confabulations in particular. So there's a kind of a two-way stream in operation. What's the idea behind this integration? Well, it's to add some critical reflection about Latin and the history of Latin to the intensive and narrow-focused grammar work that of necessity dominates the courses, while also giving students an outlet to explore their own interests and creativity. And that narrow-focused grammar work really applies mainly to the undergraduates and postgraduates, but the overall point is the same, that it's not just about this language and its mechanics, but it's about its history and its what it means in a much broader context. Really trying to echo that Maxine Green quote I talked about at the start, wide awakeness as the goal. Some screenshots for you. Here is the lesson grid of Tabella. There are currently 12 lessons. There are soon to be 15. You'll see in the top right that there's a grammar section where I've done resumes of the grammar that you need for elementary Latin. There are resources, as in there are tables of kind of noun and verb tables that you need for learning Latin. Just to note that there's a very varied range of texts. So you can see Augustus there, you can see the St. Jerome, that's about the Gospel of John. You can see Icarus from Ovid's Metamorphoses, but you can also see Colors of Gryffindor, I think. So there's a lesson about Harry Potter in Latin, and there are lessons about Latin in the modern day. So a very varied scheme of material for learners. Here's one of the lessons, one page from that lesson I mentioned on Jerome's Vulgate Bible, the Gospel of John. This is how it works. You get kind of snippets of text, you get explainers, you get vocab, and you should also, I should say, there are videos in each lesson done by members of staff offering a kind of an insider or expert perspective on what's being taught. Here are a couple of the blogs, just to give you a sense of what they're like, very much as you see them. This one is about Livy and Camillus in Livy's history. In this one, I talk about Arachne from Ovid's Metamorphoses, and I try and use that story as a way of talking about the history of weaving and the history of work. Here is the page for Line of Inquiry, that volume I mentioned of responses to Greek and Latin literature. You can see an introductory video. There's also content on that page, including interviews with the editor of that volume, Mr. Paul Corcoran, and just to give you a kind of sense of the collection. So to reflect very briefly on the work to date, Latin as a humane archive. As I said, not just all the good things that human beings do, but the less good things they do as well. Not just beautiful creative works of art, but structures of power, empire, and the like. Latin as the text of Latin as common human property. So there for anyone who wants them, a kind of democratic archive because they are artifacts from a common human past. The inherent creativity of Latin and its history, I believe, are excellent pedagogical tools, but there is nothing innately superior or useful about it in a classroom context. So that goes back to the quote by John Dewey I mentioned, not just what you teach, but how you teach it, and nothing innately super educational about Latin. A kind of tag that's been kind of going around my head for the last few months is the idea of small Latin, which would be a more humble and global view of the language, just one of the many, many cultures and literatures that have existed through time and still exist all over the world, in all different places, each with their own importance, and most of them much less talked about than Latin. So it's important to note, I think, that while Latin has been, Latin may be now a small language, quote unquote, it's been a very big language for a long time, and it's been implicated in empire and various other structures of power. And that implication means, I think, that it cannot and should not be uncritically lauded and prioritized. Okay, so small Latin is a kind of a tag that I found very useful to think with over the last few months. Just to finish then, evidence, which has been really great and satisfying for me to see, evidence of what Mary Wollstonecraft talked about in the opening slide, evidence of students' own learning. So there's the postgraduate student who is using his elementary Latin to dive into the Latin Gospels and the Latin Psalms. There is the postgraduate student who is a part-time tour guide in an Irish cathedral and is using her elementary Latin to illuminate or reflect upon kind of artifacts she sees on her tours. The All Ireland All Age Zoom lessons. So one of the unexpected benefits of the Zoom terms has been that our Wednesday evening Latin classes are now an all Ireland affair. We have students from Cork and Limerick and Monaghan and Roscommon, as well as Dublin. And that's been a great thrill for me, but also they're an all age affair and they always have been. So we have a great range of learners in those Wednesday evening classes. There's the first year student who was excited to get to see the text of Ovid in the original. She's a fan of Ovid and Ovid's poetry. And then the students of Irish who are in the first year elementary Latin class and who have been giving the class and myself very interesting insights on the history of Latin vis-a-vis the history of the Irish language. So some evidence, I like to think, of students' own learning prompted by their encounters with Latin. Thank you very much for listening. That's all I have to say. A big thank you to the conference organisers. That's Lisa, Ralph, George, Catherine and Eleanor. Big thank you to the members of the Living Latin Project, my team members, without which I wouldn't be here. That's Professor Anna Shahood, Dr. Kevin McGee, Dr. Frank Lynham, Mr. Paul Corcoran, as well as myself. And if you do have any questions or comments or feedback, feel free to get in touch with me at the email address below. Thanks for listening.